The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned lot on the outskirts of Detroit, where weeds pushed through cracked concrete and broken glass sparkled like scattered diamonds. In the center of this forgotten place stood a small wooden shed, weathered gray by countless storms. From inside came the sound of heavy breathing and the occasional scrape of metal against metal. Brutus had known nothing but the weight of chains around his neck for 3 years. The thick metal links had rubbed his fur raw, leaving permanent scars that told the story of his captivity. His world measured exactly 6 feet in each direction, the length of the chain that tethered him to a rusted car axle buried deep in the ground. Beyond this invisible circle lay a universe he could only dream about. The Pitbull's days followed a cruel routine. Morning brought stale water in a cracked bowl and whatever scraps his owner Marcus bothered to throw his way. Sometimes it was moldy bread, other times nothing at all. Brutus had learned not to expect kindness. His powerful body, once meant for running and playing, had adapted to this small prison. His muscles remained strong, but his spirit had grown as heavy as the chains that held him. Marcus used Brutus for one purpose: to make him appear tough to the other men who visited the lot. They would come at night, their voices loud and threatening, conducting business that Brutus didn't understand but instinctively feared. When strangers approached, Marcus would kick the shed and yell for Brutus to bark and growl. The dog had learned to perform this act of aggression, not from natural meanness, but from desperate hunger and the hope that compliance might earn him a scrap of food. But in the quiet moments, when no one was watching, Brutus was different. His eyes held a gentleness that contradicted everything people expected from his breed. When birds landed nearby, he would watch them with curiosity rather than aggression. When rain fell, he would tilt his head back and let the drops cool his scarred muzzle. These small moments of peace reminded him that somewhere deep inside, past the pain and fear, lived a dog who still hoped for something better. The neighborhood children knew about Brutus, though their parents had warned them to stay away. They could see his brown and white form through the gaps in the wooden fence, and sometimes they heard him whimpering in the night. 10-year-old Maria Gonzalez lived 3 blocks away, and every day on her walk to school, she could hear the clanking of his chain as he moved restlessly in his tiny domain. Maria's grandmother had told her stories about dogs who had been treated badly, and how they sometimes forgot how to trust humans. But her grandmother also believed that love could heal almost anything, given enough time and patience. These words planted a seed in Maria's young heart, though she didn't yet understand how important they would become. Winter arrived early that year, bringing bitter cold that seemed to seep into every corner of the city. Brutus had no shelter except the small shed, which leaked when it rained and provided little protection from the wind. His water bowl froze solid most nights, and he learned to lick ice just to wet his dry tongue. The chain grew so cold it burned his skin where it touched, but he had no choice but to endure it. Marcus visited less frequently during the cold months. Sometimes 3 or 4 days would pass without any food at all. Brutus learned to eat snow and to find whatever small creatures he could catch within his limited reach. His ribs began to show through his coat, and his once bright eyes grew dull with hunger and resignation. On the coldest night of the year, when the temperature dropped below 0 and the wind howled like a living thing, Brutus lay curled as tightly as possible against the shed. His breath came out in small clouds, and he shivered constantly despite his thick coat. The chain had rubbed a new wound on his neck, and dried blood matted the fur around his collar. That night, as he had done countless times before, Brutus looked up at the stars visible through the gaps in the fence. He didn't know their names or understand their distance, but something about their steady light gave him comfort. In his simple way, he made a wish that dogs all over the world were making, for warmth, for food, for a gentle hand to touch his head with kindness instead of anger. He couldn't know that change was coming. He couldn't see the future that awaited him beyond the fence, couldn't imagine the hands that would soon work to free him, or the hearts that would open to show him what love really meant. All he knew was this moment, this cold, this endless aching in his bones and soul. But even in his darkest hour, something inside Brutus refused to give up completely. Perhaps it was the same instinct that had kept his ancestors alive through countless hardships. Perhaps it was simply the stubborn hope that lives in every dog's heart. The belief that somewhere, somehow, there was a human who would see past his scars and his breed, and his broken trust to the gentle soul that waited beneath. As the wind died down, and the longest night slowly gave way to dawn, Brutus closed his eyes and dreamed of running. In his dream, his legs were strong and free, carrying him across green fields where the sun was warm and water ran clean and cold. In his dream, there was no chain around his neck, no walls to confine him, no angry voices or empty food bowls. In his dream, he was not a pit bull to be feared or a possession to be chained. He was simply a dog, beloved and free with all the time in the world to discover what joy felt like. When he woke, the chain was still there, the cold was still biting, and freedom was still just a dream. But the dream itself had become his most precious possession, proof that somewhere inside him lived a spirit too strong to be completely broken. Little did he know that less than a mile away, a woman named Sarah was making a decision that would change both their lives forever. Sarah Martinez had been an animal control officer for 8 years, but she had never grown used to what humans could do to innocent creatures. At 32, she had seen enough neglect and abuse to fill several lifetimes, yet she still felt each case like a punch to the heart. Her truck was equipped with everything she might need: tranquilizer guns, protective gear, medical supplies, but her most important tools were her patience and her ability to see hope where others saw only hopeless situations. The call came on a Tuesday morning while she was finishing her coffee in the office. An anonymous tip about a chained dog in the abandoned lot on Crenshaw Street. The caller, who sounded like a young girl, had whispered urgently into the phone before hanging up. Sarah recognized the address immediately. She had been to that neighborhood before, and it was never good news. She drove slowly through the pothole-filled streets, her trained eyes scanning for signs of animal distress. This part of the city bore the scars of economic hardship, but Sarah had learned that kindness and cruelty could exist anywhere, in any neighborhood. Her job was to find the animals who needed help and give them a chance at something better. When she pulled up to the lot, Sarah sat in her truck for a moment, observing. The fence was partially collapsed, held up more by rust than by design. She could smell the neglect before she even stepped out, that particular odor of accumulated waste, stagnant water, and despair that marked places where animals suffered in silence. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of a heavy chain dragging across concrete, then silence, then movement again. Sarah approached the fence carefully, speaking in the soft, sing-song voice she used with frightened animals. Through a gap in the wooden boards, she caught her first glimpse of Brutus. Her heart sank. The dog was thin, too thin, his ribs clearly visible beneath a coat that should have been shining with health. The chain around his neck was so thick it seemed designed for a much larger animal. Or perhaps for an animal his owner wanted to ensure could never escape. But it was his eyes that broke her heart, not the aggressive glare she had expected, but the weary resignation of a creature who had given up hope of rescue. Sarah knew she needed to be smart about this. Approaching a chained dog, especially one who had been mistreated, required careful planning. She returned to her truck and called for backup, not because she expected violence from Brutus, but because she wanted a witness to whatever they might find. She also called the police non-emergency line to report the situation and request that they locate the dog's owner. Officer James Washington arrived 20 minutes later. He was a veteran cop who had worked with Sarah on several animal cases over the years. Unlike some officers who saw animal calls as unimportant, James understood that animal cruelty often went hand in hand with other crimes, and that communities were safer when animals were treated with respect. Together, they approached the lot again. This time, Sarah noticed details that her emotional response had initially overshadowed. There was no shelter adequate for the cold weather they had been having. The water bowl was not just empty, but appeared to have been empty for some time. There were no signs of regular feeding, no food bowls, no scattered kibble, nothing to suggest that anyone cared about this dog's basic needs. Brutus watched them approach with a mixture of fear and curiosity. His experience with humans had taught him to expect the worst. But something about Sarah's voice was different from the harsh tones he was used to hearing. She spoke to him constantly as she moved, telling him that she was there to help, that he was going to be okay, that his days of being chained were numbered. The padlock on the gate was rusted but still secure. James made note of this for his report. They would need to determine legal entry. While they waited for more information about the property ownership, Sarah began documenting everything with her camera. Each photo would become evidence in what she hoped would be a successful prosecution for animal cruelty. As she worked, she kept talking to Brutus. She told him about the other dogs she had rescued, about the warm beds and full food bowls waiting at the shelter, about the volunteers who would spend time helping him remember what human kindness felt like. She didn't know if he understood her words, but she believed he could sense her intentions. The breakthrough came when Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of dried chicken she always carried for situations like this. She tossed it through the fence, landing it just within reach of Brutus's chain. He looked at it suspiciously, then at her, then back at the treat. Hunger won over caution, and he quickly grabbed the food. For the first time since she had arrived, Sarah saw something other than resignation in his eyes. It was just a flicker, but it was there. A tiny spark of interest, maybe even gratitude. She tossed another piece, this one a little closer to the fence. Again he took it, but this time he looked at her immediately afterward, as if beginning to understand that she was the source of this unexpected kindness. The property records showed that the lot was owned by someone who lived across town and was likely unaware of what was happening on his land. But finding Marcus, the man who had chained Brutus, would take more detective work. In the meantime, Sarah had enough evidence to justify removing the dog under the city's emergency powers for animal welfare. While James worked on the legal paperwork, Sarah continued her one-sided conversation with Brutus. She told him about Luna, a Pitbull mix she had rescued 2 years earlier, who now lived with a family that included 3 children and 2 cats. She described Max, another former fighting dog who had learned to love car rides and belly rubs. These stories were as much for her own hope as they were for Brutus, reminders that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, that love was stronger than cruelty. By afternoon, they had everything they needed to proceed. Sarah opened her truck and pulled out bolt cutters designed for heavy chains. As she approached the fence again, she saw Brutus watching her with what she could swear was anticipation. He seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. The chain around his neck was secured with another padlock, this one newer and more secure than the gate lock. Sarah would need to be very careful. One wrong move with the bolt cutters could injure the dog she was trying to save. She spoke constantly as she worked, her voice steady and reassuring, letting him know that each sound and movement was part of helping him. When the chain finally fell away, the sound of metal hitting concrete seemed to echo across the empty lot. Brutus stood perfectly still for a moment, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Then slowly he took a step forward, then another. For the first time in 3 years, he was moving without the familiar weight and restriction of the chain. Sarah had expected him to bolt, to run as far and as fast as his legs could carry him. Instead, Brutus walked directly to the fence where she stood. He looked up at her through the gaps in the wood, and in that moment Sarah knew that this rescue was going to be different from all the others. This dog, despite everything he had endured, still had hope. More than that, he seemed to understand that she was the person who had given him back his freedom. In his eyes, she saw not just gratitude, but the beginning of trust, the first fragile foundation upon which they would build his new life. The ride to the animal shelter was Brutus's first time in a vehicle since he was a puppy. Sarah had prepared a special transport crate in the back of her truck, lined with soft blankets and equipped with water and a few treats. But nothing could have prepared her for Brutus's reaction when she opened the crate door and gently encouraged him to step inside. He froze completely. His entire body went rigid, and Sarah could see the terror in his eyes. The enclosed space reminded him of the small shed where he had spent so many cold nights, and the idea of being confined again, even in comfort, sent waves of panic through his scarred body. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. This was a dog who had developed claustrophobia from years of confinement. She made a quick decision that went against standard protocol, but felt right in her heart. She opened all the windows in the truck cab and invited Brutus to ride up front with her. It took nearly 30 minutes of patient coaxing, with Sarah sitting on the ground beside the truck and letting him approach at his own pace. But eventually, curiosity overcame fear. The moment Brutus stepped into the truck and felt the soft seat beneath his paws, something shifted in his expression. Sarah started the engine slowly, speaking constantly to reassure him. As they pulled away from the lot, she watched in her rearview mirror as the abandoned property, his prison for 3 years, grew smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared from sight. During the 20-minute drive to the shelter, Sarah pointed out everything they passed. She showed him other dogs being walked by their owners, Children playing in parks, people going about their daily lives in a world where freedom was taken for granted. Brutus pressed his nose to the window, drinking in sights and smells he had almost forgotten existed. At the shelter, Sarah had prepared the staff for a difficult intake. Brutus would need a complete medical examination, vaccinations, and time to decompress from his trauma. But she had also warned them about something else. This dog was special. There was something in his eyes that told her he had the potential not just to heal, but to inspire others. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the shelter veterinarian, had seen hundreds of abuse cases over her 15-year career. She prided herself on maintaining professional distance while still providing compassionate care. But when Brutus walked into her examination room, something about his gentle demeanor despite his obvious suffering touched her deeply. The physical examination revealed the full extent of what Brutus had endured. The chain had left permanent scars around his neck, creating a collar of damaged fur and skin that would never fully heal. He was approximately 15 pounds underweight, suffering from mild dehydration, and had several small infections from cuts that had never been properly treated. Most concerning were his teeth, which showed signs of him trying to chew through his chain, evidence of desperate attempts to free himself. But Dr. Walsh also found reasons for hope. His heart was strong, his bones were solid despite the malnutrition, and most importantly, his temperament remained remarkably stable. Throughout the examination, which included poking, prodding, and procedures that might have caused other traumatized dogs to snap or cower, Brutus remained calm and cooperative. He seemed to understand that these strangers were trying to help him. The shelter staff prepared a special kennel for Brutus, larger than standard and equipped with extra bedding. They placed his kennel away from the busiest area, knowing he would need time to adjust to the sounds and smells of so many other animals. Sarah stayed with him for the first few hours, helping him understand that this new form of confinement was temporary and came with regular meals, fresh water, and human attention. The transformation began almost immediately. Within 24 hours, Brutus was eating regular meals with an appetite that spoke of 3 years of hunger, finally being addressed. He drank water like he couldn't quite believe it would always be available. Most remarkably, he began to show interest in the people who cared for him. Volunteer coordinator Lisa Chen had been working with shelter dogs for over a decade. She had a special gift for reading canine body language and understanding what each animal needed to begin healing. When she first approached Brutus's kennel, she expected to see the typical signs of an abuse survivor: cowering, aggression, or complete withdrawal from human contact. Instead, she found a dog who watched her with intelligent eyes and a tentative tail wag. When she sat quietly beside his kennel and began to read aloud from a book, a technique she used to help anxious animals adjust to human presence, Brutus moved closer to the kennel door. By the end of her first session, he was pressing his nose against the chain link, seeking the contact he had been denied for so long. The breakthrough came on his 4th day at the shelter. Lisa arrived to find Brutus waiting at the front of his kennel, tail wagging with genuine enthusiasm. When she opened the kennel door, he didn't rush out or cower back. Instead, he stepped out calmly and sat directly in front of her, looking up with an expression that seemed to say, "I'm ready to learn how to trust again." Their first walk was a revelation. Brutus had never been on a leash attached to a collar. He had only known the weight of chains. The feeling of a light leash and soft collar was so foreign to him that he kept turning his head to look at his neck, as if he couldn't believe something could touch him there without causing pain. Lisa led him slowly around the shelter grounds, letting him set the pace and choose where to investigate. His joy at being able to move freely, to follow interesting scents, to feel grass beneath his paws was infectious. Other staff members stopped their work to watch this scarred dog, discovering the simple pleasure of a walk. But the most remarkable moment came when they encountered another dog being walked by a volunteer. Sarah had worried that Brutus might show dog aggression, a common result of isolation and abuse. Instead, Brutus approached the other dog with respectful curiosity. His tail wagged in the universal canine language of friendship, and within minutes, both dogs were playing together like old friends. Word of Brutus's remarkable temperament began to spread throughout the shelter community. Volunteers who had been hesitant to work with a Pitbull began asking specifically to spend time with him. His gentle nature and obvious gratitude for every small kindness began to change minds, and challenge assumptions about his breed. Sarah visited him every few days, partly to check on his progress and partly because she had become personally invested in his story. She watched him gain weight, saw his coat begin to shine with health, noticed how his eyes grew brighter with each passing day. But more than the physical improvements, she saw something else developing: confidence. This was a dog who was remembering who he had been before the chains, before the neglect, before humans taught him that life was about survival rather than joy. With each positive interaction, each gentle touch, each full meal and comfortable night's sleep, Brutus was rebuilding not just his body, but his faith in the possibility of goodness. 3 weeks after his rescue, Brutus experienced something that brought tears to the eyes of everyone who witnessed it. A child visiting the shelter with her family dropped a toy through the fence of the play area, where Brutus was enjoying some outdoor time. Without hesitation, he picked up the toy and brought it back to the fence, gently placing it where the little girl could reach it. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was profound. This was a dog who had every reason to fear humans, especially after years of neglect and abuse. Yet his natural instinct was still to help, to connect, to show kindness to others. In that moment, everyone who witnessed it understood that Brutus wasn't just healing. He was teaching them something important about forgiveness, resilience, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest experiences. The weeks that followed brought small miracles disguised as ordinary moments. Brutus learned that hands could touch him without causing pain, that voices could be soft instead of harsh, and that regular meals were not something to be desperately guarded, but simply expected parts of each day. Yet with each step forward came reminders of how deep his trauma ran. Thunderstorms still sent him into panic attacks that left him trembling for hours. The sound of chains or metal clanking together would cause him to freeze completely, his eyes taking on that distant look that spoke of memories too painful to process. Sudden movements from humans still made him flinch, despite weeks of gentle handling from the shelter staff. Dr. Walsh worked closely with animal behaviorist Rebecca Torres to develop a specialized rehabilitation plan for Brutus. Rebecca had spent her career working with traumatized animals, but she found Brutus's case particularly challenging because of the unique combination of factors: physical abuse, social isolation, and what appeared to be post-traumatic stress disorder in a species that couldn't verbally process their experiences. The breakthrough in understanding Brutus's specific needs came during what Rebecca later called the blanket incident. A new volunteer was cleaning Brutus's kennel when she accidentally dropped a heavy blanket on top of him. The soft fabric should have been harmless, but Brutus's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. He collapsed to the ground and began to shake uncontrollably, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. It took Rebecca nearly an hour to calm him down, using techniques she had developed for dogs suffering from severe anxiety. But the incident revealed something important. Brutus's trauma wasn't just about chains and neglect. It was about feeling trapped, about having his choices taken away, about being helpless to escape situations that frightened him. From that day forward, everyone who worked with Brutus focused on giving him choices. Instead of simply putting a leash on him for walks, they would show him the leash and wait for him to approach. Instead of reaching into his kennel to pet him, they would sit outside and let him choose to come to them. Instead of overwhelming him with attention from multiple people, they limited his interactions to 1 or 2 familiar faces at a time. The results were remarkable. Within days of implementing this choice-based approach, Brutus began showing signs of increased confidence. His tail wagged more frequently, he made eye contact more readily, and most importantly, he began to initiate interactions with humans instead of simply tolerating them. Maria Gonzalez, the 10-year-old girl who had made the anonymous call that led to Brutus's rescue, finally convinced her parents to let her visit the shelter. She had been thinking about the chained dog every day since his rescue, wondering if he was okay, hoping that someone was taking care of him. Her grandmother had told her that sometimes children could help animals heal in ways that adults couldn't, simply because they approached the world with less fear and more hope. When Maria first saw Brutus, she gasped audibly. He was still thin, still bore the scars around his neck, but his eyes were completely different from what she had glimpsed through the fence all those months. These eyes held life, curiosity, and something that looked very much like happiness. Under Rebecca's careful supervision, Maria was allowed to sit quietly near Brutus's kennel. She didn't try to touch him or call to him. She simply sat and talked, telling him about her school, her friends, her cat named Whiskers who liked to sleep in sunbeams. Her young voice seemed to have a calming effect that surprised even Rebecca. After an hour of this one-sided conversation, something magical happened. Brutus approached the kennel door and gently pressed his nose against the chain link, directly in front of where Maria was sitting. She reached up slowly, and for the first time since his rescue, Brutus allowed a stranger to touch his face through the fence. Tears streamed down Maria's cheeks as she whispered, "I'm so sorry that man hurt you. But you're safe now. You're going to have a family that loves you." Later, Rebecca would say that she believed animals could sense sincerity in ways that adults sometimes forgot, and that Maria's genuine emotion had communicated more effectively than weeks of professional therapy. The interaction with Maria seemed to unlock something in Brutus. Over the following days, he began showing interest in other children who visited the shelter. He would watch them play, his tail wagging gently, his expression one of longing mixed with hope. The staff began to realize that despite his traumatic past, Brutus had a natural affinity for children, perhaps because they approached him with curiosity rather than pity, with acceptance rather than judgment. This discovery led to Brutus being selected for the shelter's therapy dog training program. It was an ambitious goal for a dog who had been so severely traumatized, but Rebecca believed that helping others might actually accelerate Brutus's own healing process. Many rescue dogs, she had observed, seemed to thrive when given a sense of purpose beyond their own recovery. The training began with basic obedience commands, which Brutus mastered with surprising speed. His intelligence, dulled by years of neglect, began to shine as he realized that learning new behaviors led to praise, treats, and increased freedom. More challenging was teaching him to remain calm in chaotic environments, to ignore distractions, and to provide comfort to people who might be upset or distressed. The first real test came when a local nursing home invited therapy dogs to visit their residents. Rebecca was nervous about bringing Brutus into a new environment with so many strangers, but she also sensed that he was ready for this challenge. She prepared carefully, bringing familiar toys and treats, planning short visits, and having an escape plan if he became overwhelmed. What happened exceeded everyone's expectations. Brutus entered the nursing home with calm confidence, his newly learned behaviors serving him well in the unfamiliar environment. But it was his interaction with 82-year-old Harold Peterson that truly demonstrated how far he had come. Harold had been a dog lover all his life, but a recent stroke had left him partially paralyzed and struggling with depression. He rarely spoke to visitors and showed little interest in activities designed to lift his spirits. When Brutus approached his wheelchair, Harold initially seemed uninterested, but Brutus, perhaps sensing the man's sadness, did something that brought gasps from the watching staff. He gently placed his head on Harold's lap, not seeking attention for himself but simply offering his presence as comfort. Harold's good hand slowly moved to stroke the dog's scarred head, and for the first time in months he began to speak. "You've been through hard times too, haven't you, boy?" Harold whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "But you're still here. You're still fighting." As he continued to pet Brutus, Harold began to share stories about dogs he had owned throughout his life, memories that seemed to bring light back to his eyes. The nursing home staff later reported that Harold's mood improved dramatically after that visit. He began participating in activities again, speaking more with other residents and asking repeatedly when his dog would return. Brutus had not only healed enough to help another being, he had discovered that his painful experiences could become a bridge of understanding between him and others who suffered. Word of Brutus's remarkable progress spread beyond the shelter community. Local news stations began calling, wanting to feature his story of transformation. But Sarah and Rebecca were protective of him, understanding that too much attention too soon could set back his progress. They agreed to limited coverage, focusing on his role in changing perceptions about pit bulls rather than sensationalizing his abuse. The media attention brought something unexpected: potential adopters. But Rebecca and the shelter staff had learned that Brutus was no ordinary dog, and he would need no ordinary family. His new home would need to understand trauma recovery, provide consistent structure, and most importantly, see past his breed and his scars to the extraordinary spirit within. As winter turned to spring, Brutus had been at the shelter for 4 months. He had gained 25 pounds of healthy weight, learned dozens of commands, and successfully completed his therapy dog certification. But more than the physical improvements or new skills, he had reclaimed something that chains and neglect had nearly destroyed: his ability to hope, to trust, and to love without reservation. The scared, broken dog who had cowered at the end of a chain was gone forever, replaced by a confident, gentle soul who seemed to understand that his purpose in life was to show others that healing was possible, that love was stronger than cruelty, and that every being deserved a second chance at happiness. The application arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, printed on cream-colored paper and filled out in neat handwriting that spoke of careful consideration. Emily and David Chen had been married for 12 years and had spent the last 3 searching for the right dog to complete their family. Their 8-year-old daughter Lucy had been asking for a dog since she could talk, but the Chens wanted to be sure they were ready for the responsibility and commitment that came with pet ownership. Emily worked as a pediatric nurse at the local children's hospital, while David taught high school history. They had a modest home with a fenced yard, flexible schedules that would allow for proper training and attention, and most importantly, they had researched extensively about rehabilitating traumatized animals. They weren't looking for a perfect dog. They were looking for a dog who needed them as much as they needed him. Sarah Martinez read their application with growing excitement. The Chens had specifically requested a Pitbull or Pitbull mix, understanding that these dogs faced additional challenges in finding homes due to breed discrimination. They had completed a comprehensive training course on working with rescue animals, obtained references from veterinarians and previous pet experiences, and written a heartfelt letter explaining why they felt called to adopt a dog with special needs. But what set their application apart was a single paragraph that Emily had written about her work with sick children. She explained how she had seen the healing power of therapy dogs in the hospital, how animals seemed to reach places in the human heart that medicine and words could not touch. She wrote that if Brutus was indeed being trained as a therapy dog, they would be honored to continue that work and help him fulfill his purpose of bringing comfort to others. Rebecca Torres scheduled a meeting with the Chen family on a Saturday afternoon. She wanted to observe how they interacted with Brutus, how Lucy responded to his size and scars, and whether the family truly understood the commitment they were making. Too many well-meaning families had returned traumatized dogs when the reality of rehabilitation proved more challenging than expected. The meeting took place in the shelter's special visitation room, designed to feel more like a living room than an institutional space. Rebecca brought Brutus in first, allowing him to explore the room and settle before the family arrived. He had learned to associate this room with potential adopters, and while he remained hopeful about finding a permanent home, he had also learned not to get his hopes too high when meetings didn't result in adoption. When the Chens entered, Lucy immediately knelt down to Brutus's level, but she didn't reach out to pet him. Instead, she sat quietly and began talking to him in the same gentle voice her mother used with frightened patience. She told him about her room, her toys, the special bed they had already bought for their future dog. Her natural understanding of how to approach a nervous animal impressed Rebecca immediately. Emily and David followed their daughter's lead, sitting on the floor and allowing Brutus to approach them on his own terms. They had clearly done their homework, understanding that traumatized dogs needed to feel in control of interactions, rather than being overwhelmed by eager attention from strangers. The breakthrough moment came when Lucy pulled a small photo album from her backpack. She had created a picture book showing their house, their yard, the dog bed they had prepared, even photos of the nearby park where they planned to take daily walks. As she slowly turned the pages explaining each picture, Brutus moved closer and closer until he was sitting directly beside her, looking at the photos as if he understood their significance. David, who had been quietly observing, asked Rebecca about Brutus's therapy dog training. When he learned that Brutus was certified but needed a handler who could continue his work, David's eyes lit up. He explained that his high school had been considering a therapy dog program to help students dealing with stress and trauma. The idea of Brutus not just joining their family but also continuing his mission to help others seemed to complete a puzzle none of them had realized they were solving. The home visit took place the following week. Rebecca needed to ensure that the Chen family's living situation was appropriate for a dog with Brutus's history and ongoing needs. What she found exceeded all expectations. The Chens had converted their garage into a spacious workshop where David built furniture as a hobby. But they had also created a quiet retreat space specifically for their future dog. A corner with soft bedding, calming music, and easy access to both indoor and outdoor spaces. The backyard was securely fenced with no gaps or potential escape routes. Emily had researched plants that were safe for dogs and had already removed anything that might be toxic if ingested. Most impressively, they had installed a small agility course with low jumps and tunnels, understanding that physical exercise and mental stimulation would be crucial for Brutus's continued healing. Lucy had prepared for the visit by practicing commands with a stuffed dog, showing Rebecca how she planned to help with training. Her parents had clearly educated her about the responsibilities of dog ownership, and she spoke knowledgeably about feeding schedules, exercise needs, and the importance of consistent rules and boundaries. But what sealed Rebecca's approval was a conversation she had with the Chens. Veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Liu had cared for their previous pets and spoke glowingly about the family's commitment to animal welfare. She mentioned that Emily had brought in injured strays on multiple occasions, paying for their care out of her own pocket and finding them homes. This wasn't a family making an impulsive decision. This was a family with a proven track record of putting animals' needs before their own convenience. The adoption process moved forward, but not without careful preparation. Rebecca arranged for the Chens to visit Brutus several more times at the shelter, each visit longer than the last, building familiarity and trust. She also required them to attend specialized training sessions about working with traumatized animals, even though they had already completed basic courses. During one of these visits, something happened that removed any remaining doubts about the match. Lucy had been reading to Brutus from one of her favorite books when she accidentally knocked over a metal water bowl. The sudden clanging sound, so similar to the chains that had bound him for years, sent Brutus into a panic response. He began to shake and tried to hide behind a chair, his breathing rapid and shallow. Instead of being frightened or discouraged by this display of trauma, Emily immediately shifted into her nurse mode. She spoke to Brutus in calm, soothing tones while giving Lucy and David clear, gentle instructions on how to help. Within minutes, she had guided Brutus through breathing exercises, placing her hand on his chest and showing him how to slow his respiration by following her example. More importantly, she used the incident as a teaching moment for Lucy, explaining that Brutus's fear wasn't something to be fixed quickly, but something to be understood and respected. She showed Lucy how they could help him feel safe by remaining calm themselves, by giving him space when he needed it, and by being patient with his healing process. David, meanwhile, quietly moved the metal bowl to another room and replaced it with a plastic one, understanding without being told that preventing triggers was often more helpful than managing reactions to them. His quick thinking and problem-solving approach showed Rebecca that this family understood the practical aspects of trauma recovery. The final adoption paperwork was completed on a sunny Friday in April. Brutus had been at the shelter for 5 months, transforming from a broken, chained prisoner into a confident, loving dog ready for his new life. As Sarah helped load his belongings into the Chen's car, his favorite toys, his blankets that smelled like home, his therapy dog vest for future work, she felt the bittersweet emotion that came with every successful adoption. The ride to his new home was different from that first terrifying journey from the abandoned lot. This time, Brutus sat calmly in the back seat next to Lucy, who kept up a steady stream of chatter about all the adventures they would have together. Emily and David took turns glancing back at him, still amazed that this gentle, well-behaved dog was the same animal who had been described in the rescue reports as a potential fighting dog. When they pulled into the driveway of his new home, Brutus looked out the window with curiosity rather than fear. The house was modest but welcoming, with flower boxes under the windows and a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. This wasn't just a new place to live, this was what humans called home, a concept that Brutus was only beginning to understand. Lucy opened the car door and stepped out, then turned to invite Brutus to follow. He hesitated for just a moment, not from fear but from the enormity of the moment. Somewhere in his canine consciousness, he understood that this was a new beginning, a chance to discover who he could become when he was loved unconditionally and given the freedom to simply be a dog. As his paws touched the grass of his new yard for the first time, Brutus looked up at the three humans who had chosen him. In their faces, he saw something he had never experienced before, a family that didn't want him to be anything other than himself. They didn't need him to be fierce or aggressive to prove their toughness. They didn't want him to guard prop, urdy, or frighten strangers. They simply wanted him to be their dog, their companion, their family member. For the first time in his life, Brutus was exactly where he belonged. The chains were not just physically gone, they were gone from his heart, his spirit, his future. He was free in every way that mattered, and ahead of him stretched endless days of love, purpose, and the simple joy of being alive. The first night in his new home, Brutus didn't sleep. Not because he was afraid or uncomfortable, but because he couldn't quite believe that this soft bed, this warm house, this gentle family were really his. He spent hours exploring his new domain, learning the sounds of the house settling, the smell of Lucy's stuffed animals, the comfort of David's reading chair where he was invited to rest his head. Lucy had insisted that Brutus's bed be placed in her room, and Emily and David had agreed after seeing how naturally the two had bonded. As the 8-year-old slept peacefully, Brutus positioned himself between her bed and the door, not from any trained protective instinct, but from a deep desire to keep safe this small human who had shown him such kindness. The morning brought new discoveries. The Chen family had a routine that included everyone, even their newest member. Emily woke early to prepare breakfast, and Brutus learned that he was welcome in the kitchen, that his presence was wanted rather than merely tolerated. David's morning jog became a shared activity, with Brutus trotting beside him on a leash that felt impossibly light compared to the chains he had known. But it was Lucy's morning ritual that touched Brutus most deeply. Before getting ready for school, she would sit on the floor beside his bed and tell him about her plans for the day. She would promise to think about him during math class, to save stories from recess to share with him later, to hurry home so they could play in the backyard. Her 8-year-old sincerity created a bond that seemed to heal something fundamental in Brutus's heart. The adjustment period wasn't without challenges. Loud noises still sent Brutus into panic attacks, though they were becoming less severe and shorter in duration. The garbage truck's hydraulic whine on Tuesday mornings sent him hiding in David's workshop, until Emily could coax him out with gentle words and patient presence. Thunderstorms remained his greatest fear, but the Chens learned to create a safe space in the basement where he could ride out his terror surrounded by familiar smells and soft voices. More challenging was helping Brutus understand that this new life was permanent. Dogs who have been abandoned or rehomed multiple times often live in a state of constant anxiety, never quite believing that good things last. Brutus would sometimes sit by the front door for hours, as if expecting someone to come take him away. It took weeks of consistent love and routine before he began to truly settle into the certainty of belonging. The breakthrough in his confidence came during his first visit to Jefferson High School, where David taught. The principal, Dr. Maria Santos, had been intrigued by David's proposal for a therapy dog program and had agreed to a trial visit. She had expected a well-trained but essentially ordinary dog. What she found was something extraordinary. Brutus entered the school building with calm dignity, his therapy dog vest clearly identifying his purpose. The students, initially skeptical about having a Pitbull on campus, quickly discovered that their preconceptions were completely wrong. This dog didn't swagger or intimidate. Instead, he moved through the hallways with gentle purpose, seeming to sense which students needed his attention most. 16-year-old Marcus Williams had been struggling with severe anxiety since his parents' divorce. He often spent his lunch periods hiding in the library, avoiding the social pressures of the cafeteria. When David brought Brutus to the library for their first official therapy session, Marcus initially wanted nothing to do with the dog. Pitbulls reminded him of his father's aggressive tendencies, and he associated the breed with everything he was trying to escape. But Brutus seemed to understand the teenager's fear. Instead of approaching directly, he settled himself across the room and simply existed peacefully, occasionally glancing at Marcus, but never pressuring him for interaction. After 20 minutes of this patient presence, Marcus found himself curious about the dog who didn't demand anything from him. Their first interaction was brief. Marcus simply reached out to touch Brutus's head, then quickly pulled his hand away. But in that moment of contact, something passed between them. Marcus felt the gentleness beneath the intimidating exterior, the calm strength that had nothing to do with aggression. Brutus, for his part, seemed to recognize a kindred spirit, someone who had been hurt by the world but still carried hope for something better. Over the following weeks, Marcus began seeking out Brutus during difficult days. He would find the dog in David's classroom and sit quietly beside him, sometimes talking about his problems, sometimes just drawing comfort from the warm presence of an animal who asked nothing of him but seemed to understand everything. The therapy dog program expanded as word spread about Brutus's remarkable ability to connect with troubled students. Teachers began referring kids who were struggling with everything from test anxiety to family problems to social isolation. Brutus seemed to have an intuitive understanding of what each student needed, sometimes playful interaction, sometimes just a quiet presence, sometimes the kind of unconditional acceptance that only animals can provide. Sarah Martinez visited the school several months after Brutus's adoption, wanting to see how the dog she had rescued was adapting to his new role. What she found amazed her. This was the same dog who had cowered at the end of a chain, but now he moved through the school with purpose and confidence. Students who had never shown interest in animals before were asking their parents for dogs of their own, specifically requesting Pitbulls because Brutus had shown them what the breed could really be. The most powerful moment came during a school assembly about bullying prevention. Dr. Santos had invited David and Brutus to speak about second chances in overcoming prejudice. As David told Brutus's story, carefully omitting the most graphic details of his abuse, students listened with rapt attention. When he explained how Brutus had learned to trust again despite his traumatic past, the parallels to their own struggles weren't lost on anyone. But it was what happened after the assembly that truly demonstrated Brutus's impact. A group of students who had been involved in bullying incidents approached David to ask how they could volunteer at the animal shelter. They wanted to help other dogs like Brutus, they said. They had realized that if a dog who had been so badly hurt could learn to love and trust again, maybe they could learn to be better people too. The local news picked up on Brutus's story, but this time the coverage focused on his work as a therapy dog, rather than his rescue. The segment showed him working with students, demonstrating the power of the human-animal bond to heal and inspire. But more importantly, it challenged viewers' assumptions about pit bulls, showing that these dogs could be gentle healers rather than aggressive threats. The story went viral on social media, shared by thousands of people who were inspired by Brutus's transformation. Animal shelters across the country reported increased adoptions of pit bulls and other bully breeds, with many adopters specifically citing Brutus's story as their motivation. His impact was extending far beyond the students he worked with directly. At home, Brutus settled into his role as Lucy's constant companion and the Chen family's beloved pet. He learned the schedules of everyone in the household, greeting Emily when she returned from her nursing shifts, waiting patiently for David to finish grading papers, and somehow knowing exactly when Lucy's school bus would arrive each afternoon. His favorite time was evening, when the whole family would gather in the living room. Lucy would do her homework while leaning against his warm side. David would read his historical novels with Brutus's head resting on his feet, and Emily would catch up on medical journals while absently stroking his ears. These quiet moments of domestic contentment were everything Brutus had dreamed of during his darkest days on the chain. But perhaps most remarkably, Brutus began showing behaviors that suggested he was not just receiving love, but actively giving it back. When Lucy was sick with the flu, he refused to leave her bedside, seeming to understand that she needed his comfort. When David was stressed about work, Brutus would bring him toys or simply rest his head on his lap until the tension eased. When Emily had difficult days at the hospital, she would find Brutus waiting by the door with his favorite ball, ready to play until her worries lifted. The dog who had once known only cruelty and neglect had become a source of comfort and joy for everyone he met. His story was no longer about surviving abuse. It was about transcending it, about proving that love truly could conquer the deepest wounds, and about inspiring others to see past surface appearances to the potential for goodness that exists in every living being. 2 years after his adoption, Brutus had become something no one could have predicted during those dark days on the chain. A teacher, an ambassador, and a living example of the transformative power of love. His story had spread far beyond the walls of Jefferson High School. inspiring change in communities across the country and challenging long-held prejudices about his breed. The Chen family's morning routine now included checking emails from around the world. Teachers wrote asking for advice on starting therapy dog programs. Families shared photos of Pitbulls they had adopted after hearing Brutus's story. Animal advocates requested permission to use his image in campaigns promoting rescue dogs. Each message represented lives touched by one dog's journey from despair to hope. At Jefferson High School, the therapy dog program had expanded to include 3 days per week, with Brutus working alongside David and a team of trained volunteers. The impact on student mental health was measurable and profound. Anxiety-related absences had decreased by 30% in the 2 years since Brutus's arrival. Disciplinary incidents had dropped significantly as students learned better coping mechanisms and emotional regulation through their interactions with him. Marcus Williams, the anxious teenager who had first been afraid of Brutus, had become one of the program's most dedicated student volunteers. Now a senior, he planned to study animal-assisted therapy in college, inspired by watching how Brutus could reach students that traditional counseling couldn't help. He had written his college application essay about learning to see past his own prejudices and fears through his friendship with a scarred Pitbull who had taught him that strength came from gentleness, not aggression. The program's success had attracted attention from mental health professionals and educators nationwide. Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, a researcher from the University of California, had been documenting Brutus's work for a comprehensive study on animal-assisted therapy in schools. Her preliminary findings showed that students who worked with Brutus demonstrated improved emotional regulation, increased empathy, and better social connections with their peers. But it was the individual stories that truly captured the magnitude of Brutus's impact. 15-year-old Ashley Chen, no relation to Brutus's family, had been struggling with severe depression following her mother's death from cancer. Traditional therapy had helped, but she still found it difficult to connect with others or find motivation for her future. Her guidance counselor had suggested she spend time with Brutus during her lunch periods. Ashley later described their first meeting as life-changing. She had expected to feel nothing, the numbness that had surrounded her for months protecting her from both pain and joy. But when Brutus approached her with his gentle eyes and patient presence, something in her frozen heart began to thaw. He didn't try to cheer her up or tell her everything would be okay. He simply sat beside her, sharing her sadness without trying to fix it. Over weeks of daily visits, Ashley began to open up to Brutus in ways she couldn't with human therapists. She told him about her mother, about her fears for the future, about the guilt she felt for having moments of happiness. Brutus listened without judgment, offering comfort through his presence and occasional gentle nudges when she needed to feel connected to something alive. And when the turning point came when Ashley realized that Brutus had his own story of loss and recovery. David had shared some of Brutus's history with her, helping her understand that healing was possible even after the worst experiences. If this dog could learn to trust and love again after years of abuse, maybe she could find her way back to hope too. Ashley began volunteering with the therapy dog program, finding purpose in helping other students discover the healing power of animal companionship. She started an after-school club called Pause for Peace that brought together students dealing with various challenges, united by their shared experience of finding comfort through interactions with Brutus and other therapy animals. The ripple effects of Brutus's work extended beyond the school walls. Lucy Chen, now 10 years old, had started a blog called Brutus's Big Heart, where she shared stories about her dog's therapy work and educated other children about responsible pet ownership and the importance of giving rescue animals second chances. Her innocent enthusiasm and genuine love for Brutus had touched thousands of readers, inspiring many families to consider adoption. The blog had attracted the attention of children's book publishers, and Lucy was working on her first book about Brutus's story, written from a child's perspective and designed to teach empathy and acceptance. The proceeds would go to animal shelters and therapy dog training programs, ensuring that Brutus's impact would continue to grow. Emily's work at the Children's Hospital had taken on new dimensions as well. She had advocated successfully for Brutus to make regular visits to young patients who could benefit from animal-assisted therapy. Watching children with serious illnesses light up when Brutus entered their rooms reminded Everyone, why therapy animals were so important in healing environments. 1. Of the most memorable visits involved 7-year-old Tyler, a boy undergoing treatment for leukemia, who had become withdrawn and fearful of medical procedures. When Brutus first visited Tyler's room, the child was initially scared. His treatment had made him sensitive to noise and sudden movements, and he associated dogs with the aggressive animals in his neighborhood. But Brutus seemed to sense Tyler's fragility. He approached slowly, settling himself beside the hospital bed without making any sudden movements. When Tyler tentatively reached out to touch his fur, Brutus remained perfectly still, allowing the child to explore at his own pace. Over several visits, Tyler began to look forward to seeing Brutus, asking nurses when his doggy friend would return. The breakthrough came when Tyler, feeling braver because of Brutus's presence, allowed the medical team to complete a difficult procedure without the usual struggle. He held on to Brutus's paw throughout the treatment, drawing strength from the dog's calm presence. The medical staff were amazed at the transformation. This fearful child had found courage through his connection with an animal who understood what it meant to endure pain and still choose trust. Dr. Walsh, the veterinarian who had first examined Brutus at the shelter, often reflected on the remarkable journey she had witnessed. She had seen many abused animals recover physically, but few had gone on to make such a profound impact on human lives. Brutus had become proof that healing was not just about surviving trauma, but about transforming it into something that could help others. The national attention Brutus's story received had practical implications for animal welfare. Several states had revised their dangerous dog legislation after advocacy groups used his example to demonstrate that breed-specific laws were ineffective and unfair. Shelters reported increased adoption rates for Pitbulls and other stigmatized breeds, with many adopters specifically requesting dogs that had been given up for behavioral issues or had traumatic histories. A documentary film crew had begun following Brutus and the Chen family, planning to create a feature-length film about animal rescue and the power of second chances. The filmmakers were particularly interested in how one dog's story had challenged societal prejudices and inspired policy changes that would protect thousands of other animals. But, for all the public recognition and widespread impact, Brutus remained fundamentally the same gentle soul who had learned to trust again in a small shelter kennel. His greatest joy still came from simple moments, playing fetch with Lucy in their backyard, napping in a sunny spot while Emily read nearby, accompanying David on morning jogs through their quiet neighborhood. On quiet evenings, when the Chen family gathered in their living room, Brutus would often position himself where he could see all three of his humans. In those peaceful moments, surrounded by the love he had once thought impossible, he embodied the profound truth that his story had taught the world, that every being deserves compassion, that healing is always possible, and that love truly can overcome even the deepest wounds. His scars remained visible, permanent reminders of the cruelty he had endured, but they had become symbols of survival rather than shame. Proof that what doesn't destroy us can indeed make us stronger. Children who met him learned not to fear differences but to see them as evidence of courage and resilience. Brutus had not just found freedom from his chains, he had helped free countless others from their own prisons of fear, prejudice, and despair. His story continued to spread, carried by everyone whose life he had touched, creating an ever-expanding circle of hope that reached far beyond what anyone could have imagined when Sarah first saw a chained dog in an abandoned lot. In learning to love again, Brutus had taught the world how to love better, without judgment, without conditions, with the kind of open-hearted acceptance that sees potential rather than problems, hope rather than hurt, and the infinite possibility for redemption that exists in every living being.